The night the temperature collapsed below zero, a wealthy man's fortress of logs began to bleed cold from the inside. Wind forced its way through shrinking wood, smoke turned back into the room, and a newborn's lips slowly turned blue, while pride still argued it could be fixed. Desperate and half-frozen, the family tied themselves together with a rope and staggered into a whiteout, heading toward the one cabin everyone had mocked, the one built by a silent veteran and his aging war dog. But survival inside that cabin came with its own price. As oxygen thinned and panic surged, the baby did not warm, until the veteran made a choice no one expected, placing the child against the steady breath of a scarred K9 who still carried memories of war. And just when the storm seemed over, the veteran heard one more chimney rattling in the dark. Before we begin, please let us know where you're listening from, or simply write Amen for everyone who needs warmth tonight. And if this story moves you, subscribe for more true feeling stories of courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Your support truly means a great deal to us. In late October of 1950, when the mountains of central Idaho began to sharpen their teeth for winter, Caleb Hart drove his truck into Stanley Basin with the quiet determination of a man who had already survived worse things than cold. The pickup was an old Ford, sun-faded to a dull red-brown, its engine rattling like loose bones whenever the grade steepened. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, shoulders slightly hunched forward as if bracing against an invisible headwind even inside the cab. He was 50 years old, lean but hard, the kind of man whose body had been pared down by necessity rather than neglect. His jaw was angular, shadowed by a permanent stubble of dark gray beard that he shaved only when it grew long enough to itch. Deep lines cut from his nose to the corners of his mouth, lines made not by smiling, but by years of clenching his teeth in silence. Beside him sat Sterling. Sterling was a large male German shepherd, just past 8 years old, his coat a striking mix of silver, charcoal, and pale ash, like storm clouds caught in sunlight. His chest was broad, his legs thick with muscle that had not softened despite retirement. One ear bore a small notch near the tip, an old scar from wire or shrapnel. Caleb never asked, and Sterling never told. The dog sat upright on the bench seat, posture rigid, amber eyes tracking the passing tree line with professional intensity. Every so often, his ears flicked sharply at the pop of gravel beneath the tires or the distant crack of wind through pine, as if cataloging threats that no longer officially existed. They had both been trained to read landscapes the way other men read faces. The road dropped steeply into the basin, opening onto a wide, empty valley cut cleanly by the silver ribbon of the Salmon River. The Sawtooth Mountains rose on all sides, jagged and pale, already dusted with early snow. The view was beautiful in the way a blade could be beautiful clean, sharp, and utterly indifferent to the hand that held it. Caleb slowed at a turnout and shut off the engine. The silence rushed in, thick and immediate. Even Sterling stilled, his breath faint in the cooling air. "This is it," Caleb said quietly, resting a rough hand on the dog's neck. "End of the line." Sterling pressed his nose briefly against Caleb's wrist and exhaled once, a low, steady sound. It was not comfort, exactly. It was acknowledgment. They continued on toward town. Stanley was little more than a scattering of buildings huddled together as if for warmth. A general store, a post office, a diner with a single gas pump out front, and beyond them the lumber yard owned by Wade Hollister. Wade Hollister stood on the porch of his office when Caleb pulled in, wiping sawdust from his hands with a red bandana. He was a big man in his early 50s, thick through the chest and belly, built like someone who had spent a lifetime lifting things heavier than himself. His beard was full and reddish-brown, flecked with gray, trimmed neatly as if to signal respectability. His eyes were pale blue and sharp, the kind that seemed friendly until you noticed how quickly they measured whatever stood before them. "Caleb Hart," Wade boomed, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Didn't think you'd make it up before the snow set in." Caleb shook his hand. Wade's grip was strong, confident, used to being returned without hesitation. Caleb's was steady, though his fingers twitched once before stilling. Sterling moved closer to Caleb's leg, his body angled subtly forward. Wade noticed and paused half a step back, the smile faltering just long enough to be real. "Fine dog," Wade said, clearing his throat. "Army?" "K-9, Caleb replied. "Retired." Wade nodded, already losing interest in the answer. He turned and gestured toward the office. "Let's get this paperwork done." Inside, the office smelled of pine sap, oil, and old coffee. Maps were pinned to the walls, their edges curling. Wade spread one out across the desk and jabbed a thick finger at a narrow wedge of land on the north side of the basin. 40 acres, cheapest ground in Custer County, he said. "Right here, bit exposed though, wind comes straight down off the peaks." Caleb studied the map without reacting. He could already see it in his mind, the way the hills funneled air, how pressure would build and release, where snow would drift and harden like concrete. "Locals call it the funnel," Wade added, chuckling. "Nobody sticks around long, but you strike me as a man who likes quiet." Wade thought of the land as a problem to be resold later. He did not say this out loud. He had sold that parcel before twice. Each time, the buyer fled by February. Each time, Wade reclaimed the deed and whatever half-finished structure remained. This man, with his haunted eyes and strange dog, looked like another winter investment. "It'll serve my purposes," Caleb said, and slid an envelope across the desk. Wade's eyebrows lifted slightly at the weight of it. Cash, all of it. By the time Caleb left the office, the deal was done. At Roy Bennett's general store, the reaction was less polite. Roy was thin, stooped, with wire-frame glasses and a perpetual squint that came from years of watching weather more than people. When Caleb placed his order lime wire nails, Roy blinked. "Not much firewood on that list," Roy said carefully. From the corner near the stove, a man laughed. "Farming rocks, stranger?" Sterling's head snapped up. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Not a growl, but close enough. The laughter stopped. Caleb didn't look at them. "You have it or not?" he asked Roy. Roy nodded and began gathering supplies, shaking his head as if watching a slow-motion accident. An hour later, Caleb stood on his land. The wind was constant here, not gusting but pressing, as if the valley itself exhaled without pause. Sterling stayed tight against Caleb's side, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the narrow gap in the hills to the north. "This place doesn't want us," Caleb murmured. Sterling answered with a thin, anxious whine. Caleb smiled, not with humor, but with grim satisfaction. "That's why it was cheap." As the sun slid behind the mountains, shadows bruised the valley purple, and the temperature began its quiet descent, Caleb unloaded the first cedar posts from the truck. He marked the ground, measured carefully, and raised the sledgehammer. The first strike rang out across the basin like a challenge. He wasn't building a cabin. He was building a boundary. Let the wind come. By early November, the days in Stanley Basin shortened with unnerving speed, as if the sun itself were reluctant to linger in a place already preparing its trap. Caleb Hart worked from first light until the cold forced his hands into numb obedience, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. He rose before dawn, boiled coffee over a small fire, fed Sterling, and then returned to the grid of cedar posts rising from the frozen ground like the ribs of some prehistoric animal. The structure confused anyone who happened to pass on the distant road. Caleb was not building outward, as most men would. He was building inward. After setting the first rectangle of posts, he measured again and drove a second line exactly 12 inches outside the first, each post placed with engineer's precision. Between them lay a narrow cavity, a deliberate void. He intended to leave that space empty of movement, a pocket of trapped air that would refuse to carry heat away. Sterling watched from the edge of the site, his silver-gray coat bristling in the wind. The dog paced slow arcs around the perimeter, nose low, tail stiff, ears constantly swiveling. At times he stopped altogether, staring toward the northern gap in the hills where the wind poured through without pause. A thin, uneasy sound slipped from his throat, not loud enough to be called a whine, but sharp enough to raise the hair along his spine. "You hear it too," Caleb said once, pausing with the sledgehammer resting against his shoulder. "That's fine. We're listening." Sterling did not relax. Caleb moved next to the creek that fed into the Salmon River, wading into water so cold it burned like dry ice. His boots soaked through within minutes, but he barely noticed. He tore great clumps of moss from the rocks, green and heavy, slick with icy water, piling them onto a tarp. He worked with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that rushing only made things worse. When the tarp was full, he hauled it back to the site and spread the moss out to drain, mixing it with prairie grass he had cut from the meadow and hauled in bundles on his shoulder. The next step puzzled the locals most. Caleb dumped the moss and grass into a rusted metal trough, then slid open a bag of agricultural lime, the white powder blooming into the air. He added ash from his campfire, gray and bitter-smelling, and began turning the mixture with a shovel. The exertion sent steam rolling from his breath, but his face remained expressionless, jaw locked. "Pay attention," he muttered to Sterling, who had sat down to watch, head tilted slightly. "You can't just stuff a wall with plant matter. Mice will move in, bugs will eat it, moisture will rot it from the inside out." He drove the shovel through the mixture again. Lime and ash dry it, preserve it, makes it hostile. Nothing wants to live in it. Sterling's eyes followed the shovel, unblinking, as if committing the lesson to memory. As Caleb worked the mixture, the smell hit him. Wet earth, ash, something sour and metallic beneath it. The wind fell away. The creek vanished. For a moment, the sawtooths dissolved into another forest entirely. The Ardennes, 1944. Caleb was no longer 50. He was a young combat engineer crouched in a shallow foxhole carved into frozen mud, trees shattered above him like snapped bones. The cold was not outside, it was inside everything. Beside him, Private Eli Turner, barely 18, face still soft with youth, shivered uncontrollably, his lips tinged blue beneath a wool scarf stiff with ice. Eli had lied about his age to enlist. Caleb had signed off on it. He had told himself the kid would be safer with engineers than with infantry. "I can't feel my hands, Sarge," Eli whispered. Caleb had pulled him closer, shared his own body heat, packed pine boughs and leaves against the sides of the hole, but the cold had crept through anyway. It always did. Some time before dawn, the shivering stopped. Caleb had known what that meant even before he looked. The memory hit like a blow to the chest. Caleb dropped the shovel. His fingers clenched reflexively into the lime-soaked moss, knuckles whitening. The tremor started in his hands and traveled up his arms, rattling his teeth. He was kneeling in Idaho again, but the past wrapped around him with suffocating clarity. Sterling reacted instantly. The dog crossed the space in 2 strides and pressed his full weight against Caleb's side, shoulder firm, warm, real. He shoved his nose beneath Caleb's arm, forcing contact, anchoring him to the present. A sharp, insistent huff escaped the dog's chest. "I'm here," Caleb whispered, burying his face in the thick fur along Sterling's neck. "I'm here." The shaking eased, though the memory did not. It hardened into something denser, something heavier. When Caleb stood again, his movements changed. The careful rhythm became surgical. He treated the insulation with extra lime, packed it gently but thoroughly between the double walls, checking for gaps with bare hands despite the cold. He imagined the wind as a living thing, probing, searching for weakness, and he resolved to give it none. From the road, the structure looked wrong, too thick, too squat, too deliberate. Wade Hollister drove by one afternoon in his red logging truck, slowing to a crawl as he took in the sight. He leaned out the window, beard flecked with sawdust, eyes narrowed with amusement. "That thing looks like it's wearing a fat suit," Wade called. "Ugliest damn cabin I've ever seen." Caleb didn't stop working. He slid another handful of insulation into place, tamped it down lightly and straightened. "It's thick for a reason," he said evenly. "Waste of lumber," Wade laughed. "You see my place? 10 cords of seasoned pine stacked already. That's how you survive winter up here. Burn hot and burn fast." Caleb finally looked at him. "Wood shrinks when it gets cold," he said. "At 30 below, your logs will contract. The chinking will pull away. You won't have walls anymore. You'll have cracks." Wade's smile twitched just slightly. "I've lived here 20 years, he snapped. "I know how a log cabin works." Caleb nodded once. "Physics doesn't care how long you've lived somewhere." Wade scoffed and rolled away, but the words followed him down the road, a quiet abrasion against certainty. That night, the temperature dropped hard and fast. The porch beams groaned as fibers contracted, popping like distant rifle fire. Inside the half-finished cabin, the air was already different. Still. Heavy. When Caleb lit the stove for the first time, the heat lingered instead of fleeing upward. Sterling lay near the fire, head on his paws, watching the shadows crawl along the thick walls. Caleb checked the barometer he'd hung by the door. The needle was falling. "Soon," he murmured. Outside the wind rose, not yet screaming, but testing, pressing its cold face against the unfinished fortress as if memorizing its shape. Sterling's ears pinned back, his tail tucked slightly, body tense. Caleb rested a hand on the wall he had built, feeling its density, its promise. "We're ready," he said, though whether he meant the cabin or himself was unclear. The wind answered with a long rising howl that carried down from the mountains like a warning. The cold arrived the way a siege begins, not with noise, but with certainty. It slid down from the sawtooths in a slow, merciless press, pinning Stanley Basin beneath a sky bleached white and brittle. By dusk, the temperature fell past zero and kept falling, the barometer sinking as if pulled by gravity alone. The wind changed character, too. It no longer tested edges, but leaned into them, steady and patient, memorizing weaknesses. Inside Caleb Hart's cabin, the fire burned low and deliberate. He had throttled it down to a slow, blue-edged flame, the damper half closed, the intake adjusted by fractions he could feel more than see. Heat lingered in the walls and the trapped air between them, a quiet reservoir that refused to flee. Sterling lay stretched on his side near the hearth, 8 years old and solid as a statue, his silver-gray coat catching the firelight. The dog lifted his head once when the wind rose, ears angling back, then settled again, reassured by the stillness that wrapped the room like a held breath. Caleb checked the thermometer and nodded. The system was holding. Outside could do what it liked. Across the basin, Wade Hollister's house began to fail. Wade's place was a monument to success. 2 stories of heavy log construction, broad windows, a stone chimney that announced permanence. He had built it to impress and to endure, stacking seasoned pine in tall, confident cords beneath the eaves. When the wind first hit, he felt the familiar surge of pride. He fed the stove hard, let the flames roar, and told himself the noise meant strength. Mabel Hollister felt it first. Mabel was in her late 50s, broad-shouldered and thick through the hips from a lifetime of work that never quite fit into a job title. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, had gone iron gray and was usually twisted into a bun that emphasized her strong neck and steady jaw. She had raised children, run crews, and outlasted men who underestimated her. That night, as she crossed the living room with a basket of kindling, the cold struck her ankles like a blade. She stopped, frowned, and bent down, pressing her palm to the floorboards. "They're bleeding," she said quietly. Wade laughed from his chair, beard bristling as he leaned back. "Drafts," he said. "Happens." But Mabel straightened slowly, her breath fogging the air. "No," she said. "This is different." The logs began to pop sharp, cracking reports as the temperature plunged and the wood contracted. Hairline gaps opened along the chinking, invisible, until the wind found them. Then the house sighed. Curtains lifted and fell, though every window was latched tight. Smoke curled backward from the stove, thin and acrid, stinging the eyes. Lena Hollister clutched her son tighter. Lena was 26, tall and narrow-shouldered, her brown hair cut short after the baby came. A practical choice she still felt guilty about. Her skin had the pallor of someone who hadn't slept well in months, and her eyes were perpetually watchful, as if she expected the world to make a sudden, unfair demand. Noah, 3 months old and too small for the winter he'd been born into, lay bundled against her chest. His lips had gone faintly blue, a subtle color that might have been missed by someone less afraid. "Wade," she said, voice tight. "He's cold." Wade stood, irritation sharpening his movements. "He's fine. Babies cry. That's what they do." Noah did not cry. He whimpered once, then went quiet, his breathing shallow and fast. Ethan Hollister shoved towels into the gaps along the wall, fingers reddening and splitting as the cold bit through the fabric. Ethan was 30, lean and long-armed, with his father's eyes but not his confidence. He had grown up in this house, learned to read wind and weather by watching his mother's face, and something in her expression now scared him more than the storm. "It's not stopping," Ethan said. "The wind's inside." The phrase landed heavily. Wade looked around and, for the first time, saw the truth of it. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a funnel. Smoke poured back into the room in earnest, gray and choking. Mabel sank into a chair, her legs failing beneath her. She tried to stand again and couldn't feel her feet. Wade's pride cracked then, clean and sudden. "Get the rope," he barked, voice hoarse. "Now!" They moved with the efficiency of people who understood danger, even if they had never admitted it before. Wade looped the rope around his waist and passed it down the line. Mabel, then Lena with Noah, then Ethan bringing up the rear. He opened the door and the cold punched in like a living thing, stealing breath and courage in the same instant. The storm erased distance. The world beyond the porch was nothing but white motion and noise. Wade leaned forward and stepped into it, pulling the rope taut behind him. He knew where he was going. As the wind shoved him sideways, a thought rose unbidden, ugly and sharp. If Caleb Hart had frozen in that ridiculous cabin, there would be shelter waiting. He would not have to beg. He would only have to take. The thought burned, but it kept his legs moving. Across the basin, the Hollisters became shapes, then shadows, then little more than the sound of fabric snapping and breath tearing from lungs. Snow packed into collars and cuffs. Lena felt Noah's weight shift against her chest and panicked, pressing him tighter, whispering his name until her voice broke. Mabel stumbled, her grip on the rope slackening as her feet lost sensation. Inside his cabin, Caleb felt the change. It came not as noise, but as pressure. A subtle tightening in the walls, a shift in how the heat moved. Sterling lifted his head and stood, body rigid, hackles rising. His ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the door. Caleb rose and crossed to the small window, peering out into the white churn. At first he saw nothing. Then a darker shape lurched into view, followed by another, the rope between them cutting a brief line through the storm. "Damn it," Caleb muttered, already reaching for his coat. The wind howled louder, as if in protest. Sterling moved to the door and planted himself there, waiting, breath steaming, every muscle coiled. The first knock came faintly, swallowed by the storm. The second landed harder, desperate, the sound of bone against wood. Caleb's hand closed around the latch. Outside, Wade Hollister sagged against the door, strength bleeding away with the heat from his body, the rope dragging behind him like a confession. Sterling smelled them before Caleb heard anything at all. The dog rose from his place by the hearth, head lifting, nostrils flaring as if the storm itself had spoken a language only he understood. His ears pinned back, then angled forward again, reading distance and desperation in the wind. A low, urgent huff left his chest. Caleb was already moving. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides and swung open the outer door into the narrow buffer space he had built on purpose, the small, unheated vestibule that separated the killing cold from the warmth inside. Snow exploded inward, stinging his face, but he held his ground, bracing the door with his shoulder. "Here!" he barked into the white chaos. "One at a time." Wade Hollister collapsed first, his big frame slamming into the threshold like a felled tree. His beard was iced white, his eyelids rimmed with frost, the skin of his cheeks waxy and pale. He was shaking so hard his teeth rattled audibly. The rope was still knotted around his waist, trailing backward into the storm like a lifeline half chewed through. Caleb hauled him into the vestibule and cut the rope clean with his knife. He shut the outer door, sealing the storm out, and turned immediately to the inner door. Sterling wedged himself sideways to help, broad shoulder braced as if he'd practiced this exact maneuver his whole life. Mabel came next, half carried, half dragged. Her thick coat was soaked through, her boots packed with snow. Her legs buckled the moment she crossed the threshold. Ethan stumbled in behind her, breath tearing from his chest in raw animal sounds, hands bleeding where towels and rope had cut into skin. Lena followed last, clutching Noah tight against her chest, her face gray with terror, eyes too wide, lashes crusted with ice. Caleb shut the inner door and turned the latch. The sudden quiet was shocking. The storm beat against the walls like fists, but it was outside now, reduced to noise. "Clothes, now," Caleb said, voice flat, commanding. "All of them." Wade started to protest, instinct rising before thought. "You can't!" Caleb cut him off with a look sharp enough to stop a charge. "Wet fabric kills faster than cold air. Sit down." He moved through the room with the efficiency of a man whose body remembered emergencies even when his mind wished it wouldn't. Coats came off, then boots, then layers peeled away and piled near the door. He wrapped Mabel in blankets, checked her feet with bare hands, noting the alarming lack of response. He pressed a mug of steaming tea into Ethan's hands, forcing his fingers closed around it until color began to creep back into the knuckles. The cabin filled with breath. 6 people, 1 dog. The air thickened, growing heavy and sweet, the windows fogging over until the outside vanished entirely. Caleb noticed it instantly. He crossed to the oil lamp hanging from the beam and studied the flame. It had elongated, stretching unnaturally tall, the tip flickering blue. His jaw tightened. "We need air," he said, already reaching for the ceiling vent. Wade lurched forward, panic surging through his exhaustion. "No," he rasped, grabbing Caleb's arm. "You let the cold in. We're done. We just got warm." Caleb stopped and pointed at the lamp. "That flame's starving," he said. "So are we. You want warm or you want alive?" Wade stared at the light, comprehension dawning with painful slowness. His hand fell away. Caleb cracked the vent just enough to let fresh air bleed in, a controlled exchange rather than a surrender. The flame shortened, steadied. The room breathed again. Lena made a small broken sound. Caleb turned. Noah lay limp against her chest, his tiny face frighteningly still. The faint blue around his lips had deepened. His skin felt cold through the layers of cloth, not chilled, but empty of heat, as if the cold had claimed him already. "Caleb," Lena whispered, her voice folding in on itself, "he's not warming." Caleb's mind moved faster than fear. Fire was too violent, hot water too slow. Skin to skin would help, but the room was already compromised, oxygen precious. He needed heat that was constant, gentle, alive. His eyes went to Sterling. "Here," Caleb said softly. The dog stepped forward at once, obedience absolute. Up close, his age showed in the graying fur around his muzzle and the faint stiffness in his hind legs. But his eyes were steady, intelligent, unafraid. Caleb guided him to the floor beside the sofa and gave a single, precise command. Sterling lay down on his side, exposing the dense, heat-rich fur of his chest and belly. Lena hesitated, hands trembling. "It's okay," Caleb said. "He'll hold still." Sterling's tail thumped once, slow and reassuring. Lena lowered Noah carefully, pressing the baby against the dog's warmth. Sterling adjusted instinctively, curling his body just enough to cradle the fragile weight without crushing it. His breathing slowed, deep and rhythmic, each exhale a soft gust of life. The room went silent. Minutes stretched, measured by the crackle of the stove and the distant scream of the wind. Caleb watched Noah's face with clinical focus, counting breaths, scanning color. Wade stood frozen, his massive hands clenched uselessly at his sides, eyes fixed on the child he had nearly lost. Then, almost imperceptibly, the blue faded. Noah's lips flushed pink. His chest hitched, then filled. A thin cry cut through the stillness, weak at first, then stronger, indignant, alive. Lena collapsed forward, sobbing, her forehead pressed to Sterling's shoulder. Ethan let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a prayer. Mabel stirred beneath her blankets, her brow furrowing as sensation crept back into her legs. Wade's knees gave out. He sat heavily in a chair, staring at the dog as if seeing him for the first time. "That thing," he murmured hoarsely. "That thing saved my boy." Sterling lifted his head and licked Noah's forehead once, a brief deliberate gesture, then settled again. Caleb exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He moved to the window and scraped a circle clear of fog. Outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy. Snow drove sideways, erasing the world beyond a few feet. From somewhere deep in the basin, a sound carried through the wind. Not the storm's voice, but something else. A hollow, rhythmic clatter, metal against brick, swallowed and returned by gusts. Caleb stilled. His eyes narrowed, listening past the noise, past the fear. He knew that sound, a loose chimney cap. His hand tightened on the sill. There was another house out there. The storm eased some time after midnight, not ending so much as loosening its grip, like a fist that had grown tired of crushing. Inside the cabin, the fire had settled into a steady glow, the kind of heat that no longer demanded attention. Everyone slept. Wade slumped forward in a chair. Ethan sprawled on the floor with a blanket over his shoulders. Lena curled protectively around Noah, who breathed softly against her chest, finally warm. Caleb did not sleep. He sat on the edge of the table, boots still on, hands wrapped around a tin mug gone cold. His eyes tracked the slow swing of the oil lamp, listening to the cabin the way a sailor listens to a ship at night. The walls held. The wind slid past instead of through. Everything he had built did exactly what it was supposed to do. And that was the problem. There were 7 chimneys in Stanley Basin. He had counted them once, years ago, the way some men counted stars. 7 meant 7 places where smoke rose in winter, 7 lives that had chosen to stay. Tonight, as the storm slackened, Caleb realized the count was wrong. There was an 8th. Evelyn Harper's chimney stood alone at the far end of the basin, barely visible from the road, attached to a small, single-wall house that had never been meant to face a winter like this. Evelyn Harper was 80 years old, slight and bird-boned, with silver hair she kept braided down her back and skin the color of old paper. She had been a schoolteacher for 4 decades, patient and precise, her voice calm enough to quiet rooms full of restless children. After her husband died, she had refused to leave. "Someone needs to remember this place," she'd once told Caleb in the store, her eyes sharp behind thick lenses. Independence had hardened into habit. Caleb stood. Sterling stirred immediately, lifting his head. The dog's eyes met Caleb's, and something passed between them, recognition and fear. Sterling's body tensed, shoulders tightening, tail lowering. The storm had awakened old ghosts in him, too. Somewhere beneath the discipline and loyalty lay memories of explosions, screaming wind, and commands shouted into chaos. Caleb reached for the harness. Sterling backed away, not far, just enough to make his refusal clear. Caleb stopped. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, bringing his eyes level with the dog's. Up close, Sterling's age showed more clearly now, the faint clouding at the edges of his amber eyes, the stiffness he tried to hide when he rose too fast. A veteran, like Caleb, carrying battles he had never been allowed to forget. "I won't make you," Caleb said quietly. His voice was steady, honest. "But she's out there alone." Sterling's ears flicked. He looked toward the door, then back at Caleb. His breathing quickened, the war between instinct and fear written plainly in the tension of his frame. Caleb rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "I'm scared too." The words mattered. After a long moment, Sterling stepped forward. He lowered his head and pushed it into the harness, the leather creaking softly as Caleb buckled it into place. The decision was his. They stepped into the night together. The basin was unrecognizable under snow. Drifts rose like frozen waves, the world reduced to shape and shadow. The wind still cut hard, but its edge had dulled. Caleb moved deliberately, planting each step before committing weight. Sterling ranged ahead and back, nose low, checking paths, circling when the snow grew treacherous. Evelyn's house appeared as a dark hunch against the white, smoke barely whispering from the chimney. The sound Caleb had heard earlier, the hollow clatter, came again, metal rattling loosely in the wind. He knocked. No answer. The door opened only after Caleb leaned into it with his shoulder. Inside, the air was thin and bitter. Evelyn lay on the narrow bed near the stove, blankets piled high but useless. Her breathing was shallow, each rise of her chest a small effort. When Caleb touched her hand, it was cold enough to steal warmth from his skin. "Evelyn," he said, bending close. "It's Caleb." Her eyelids fluttered. A faint sound escaped her lips, more breath than word. "Cold," she whispered. He couldn't move her. The storm might be weakening, but it was still deadly. Dragging her through it would finish what the cold had started. Caleb's mind settled into problem-solving, the same calm that had carried him through worse nights than this. "Room within a room," he murmured. He worked quickly, dragging straw bales from the shed and stacking them around the bed, building a crude inner wall. He stretched a heavy tarp over the top, sealing the space, leaving only a narrow opening. The straw smelled dry and sweet, a promise of insulation. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. It needed to hold. Sterling lay down on one side of the bed at Caleb's command, pressing his body close. Caleb took the other side, boots braced against the straw, his back to the tarp. Between them, Evelyn lay cradled in heat that breathed and shifted and lived. Time slowed. Evelyn's breathing deepened gradually, the harsh rasp easing into something steadier. Color returned to her cheeks, faint but real. She opened her eyes and looked at Caleb, confusion giving way to recognition. "You always were stubborn," she murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her mouth. "Learn from the best," Caleb said. Outside, dawn crept into the basin, pale and tentative. By the time the sun cleared the peaks, the storm had spent itself. Tracks appeared in the snow as Wade and Ethan arrived with a sled, their faces drawn and humbled. Wade knelt beside Sterling first, laying a hand on the dog's broad head, his fingers lingering in the thick fur. "I sold you that land knowing it would break a man," Wade said quietly later, standing at Caleb's threshold. "And last night, I hoped it had. I'm not proud of that." Caleb met his eyes. "Pride doesn't keep you warm." Wade nodded, shame and relief crossing his face in equal measure. Spring came slowly that year. Snow receded. The basin breathed again. Caleb kept his cabin, thick walls and all, but the door no longer stayed locked. Sometimes it stood open, letting light and voices in. The fortress remained. The man inside it did not.